London, June 1820. The morning light streamed through the stained glass windows of St. George's Church, Hanover Square, casting pools of crimson and sapphire across the stone floor where Lady Octavia Kingsley stood, frozen in her ivory silk gown. 500 guests filled the pews behind her, a susurrus rising to the vaulted ceiling like the prayers of the damned. Her hands trembled inside her lace gloves as she stared at the man who was supposed to become her husband in mere moments, Lord Percival Mortimer, whose handsome face had transformed into something cruel and calculating. The vicar's voice echoed through the vast space, intoning the ancient words with practiced solemnity. If any person present knows of any lawful impediment to this marriage, let them speak now or forever hold their peace. The silence that followed should have been brief, perfunctory. Instead, it stretched into something terrible. Then Lord Percival raised his hand, slowly, deliberately, and spoke words that would shatter Octavia's world into 1,000 irreparable pieces. I know of such an impediment. If stories of love born from public humiliation and unexpected salvation move your heart, subscribe now and join us on this journey. You will not want to miss what happens next. The collective gasp created a sound like wind through a crypt. She felt the blood drain from her face, her vision narrowing to a pinpoint focused on Percival's satisfied smirk. She clung to the desperate hope that this was some elaborate, cruel jest. "I discovered only yesterday," Percival announced, his voice carrying to every corner of the church with theatrical precision, "that the Kingsley family has perpetrated a fraud upon my family and myself. The promised dowry of £20,000 does not exist. Indeed, there are substantial debts." Octavia heard her mother's sharp intake of breath behind her, saw her father rise from his seat, face flushed with mortification. But Percival was not finished with his public evisceration. "Furthermore," he continued, turning his cold gaze upon Octavia herself, "I have come to realize that my intended bride is peculiar. She reads scientific treatises as though she were a man. She speaks of botanical matters at dinner parties, boring all present with her unfeminine interests. She is, in short, an embarrassment that I cannot, in good conscience, present to society as Lady Mortimer." The words struck like physical blows. Octavia stood immobilized, feeling the weight of every eye upon her, hearing the rising tide of scandalous whispers. Her vision blurred with tears she refused to let fall, vowing she would not break down in front of them all. "Percival, please," her father's voice, desperate and broken. "I shall save myself £40,000 by not settling your debts," Percival declared, already turning away from the altar. "Find some other fool to wed your peculiar daughter, Kingsley. I am finished with this charade." He strode down the aisle with purposeful steps, leaving Octavia standing alone before God and all of society. The whispers grew louder, more vicious. Her mother had begun to weep. Her father stood frozen, face gray as ash. Octavia felt the walls closing in, her breath coming in short gasps. She needed to flee, to run, to disappear. "I must interrupt these proceedings." The voice came from the back of the church, deep, commanding, with an edge of authority that cut through the chaos like a blade through silk. The whispers ceased, as though severed. Every head turned toward the source of that unexpected declaration. A figure emerged from the shadows near the great doors, moving with unhurried precision down the center aisle. He was dressed entirely in black. Coat, waistcoat, breeches, even his cravat was tied with black silk. A walking stick of ebony topped with silver clicked against the stone floor with each measured step, though he showed no sign of requiring its support. As he drew closer to the altar, moving through the pools of colored light from the windows, details became visible. Hair as dark as midnight, eyes of such deep green they appeared black in certain lights, and a thin scar that traced along his jaw from ear to chin. It was then that recognition rippled through the assembled crowd like a stone cast into still water. "Dear Lord in heaven, it cannot be the Earl of Ashbourne, the ghost Earl himself. I thought him dead these 7 years." Octavia had heard the whispers, of course. Everyone in the ton knew of Nathaniel Fairfax, the Earl of Ashbourne, who had vanished from society following the tragic deaths of his wife and young son in a shipwreck off the Cornish coast. Some claimed he had gone mad with grief. Others insisted he had died as well, and that his estate was managed by distant relatives who perpetuated the fiction of his existence. None had seen him in London for 7 years, yet here he stood, very much alive, stopping before Octavia with the bearing of a man accustomed to absolute authority. He was older than Percival by several years. She judged him to be in his mid-30s, and there was something in his face that spoke of suffering survived, of depths plumbed and endured. His presence alone commanded the silence of the entire assembly, as though he carried with him an authority that transcended mere title or rank. His green eyes met hers, and for a moment the entire church seemed to hold its breath. "Lady Octavia Kingsley," he said, his voice pitched for her ears alone, though in the absolute silence it carried to every pew. "Lord Mortimer is a fool who cannot recognize value when it stands before him. Intelligence in a woman is not a defect. It is a treasure of exceeding rarity." Before she could respond, before she could even process his words, he turned to address the vicar. "This church has been reserved for a wedding. The bride is present and ready. It appears only the groom was in error." He looked back to Octavia, and something shifted in his expression. Not warmth precisely, but a kind of recognition, as though he saw something in her that others had missed. "Lady Octavia, I offer you my hand. Marry me. Here. Now. In the ceremony that has already been prepared." The church erupted into chaos. Shouts of shock and disbelief mingled with the scraping of pews as people rose to their feet. Someone fainted. One of the Mortimer cousins, Octavia thought distantly. But loudest of all was Percival's furious voice as he pushed his way back up the aisle. "What madness is this?" he shouted. "Ashbourne, she is nothing. A penniless peculiarity with no prospects." Nathaniel turned his head slowly, fixing Percival with a gaze that could have frozen the Thames in midsummer. When he spoke, his voice carried the quiet menace of a blade drawn in darkness. "She is worth more than you shall ever be, Mortimer, and your father knows precisely why I say so." The threat, veiled but unmistakable, hung in the air between them. Octavia saw Lord Thaddeus Mortimer, Percival's father and head of the Mortimer banking empire, pale visibly from his seat near the front. Whatever history lay between the Fairfax and Mortimer families, it was sufficient to silence Percival's protests. Octavia found her voice at last, though it emerged as barely more than a whisper. "My lord, you do not know me. This is madness." "I know enough," Nathaniel replied, his attention returning to her. "You require salvation from this public humiliation and the ruin it would bring upon your family. I require a countess. It is a fair exchange." His words were pragmatic, emotionless, a business transaction proposed before hundreds of witnesses. Yet there was something in his eyes, a flicker of understanding that suggested he knew exactly what it felt like to be broken in public view. She looked at him, at this intense, severe stranger, and saw something entirely absent from Percival's face. Recognition. He did not look at her as if she were peculiar, but as if she were formidable. And Octavia, standing in her wedding gown before an altar where she had just been rejected and ridiculed, realized she had no other choice. Refusal would seal her family's destruction. Her father owed £40,000 to the Mortimer Bank, debts that would be called in immediately now that the marriage alliance had collapsed. They would lose everything. "I accept," she heard herself say, the words emerging with surprising steadiness. The vicar, who had stood throughout this entire extraordinary scene with his mouth agape, found his voice. "My Lord Ashbourne, this is most irregular." "The license is valid," Nathaniel stated flatly. "The bride and groom are both of age and present of their own free will. The only change is the name of the groom. Proceed." And so, In a ceremony that would be discussed in drawing rooms and ballrooms for years to come, Lady Octavia Kingsley married Nathaniel Fairfax, Earl of Ashbourne, speaking the same vows she had prepared to give to Percival Mortimer, but binding herself to a man who was little more than a stranger cloaked in legend and mystery. When the vicar pronounced them man and wife, Nathaniel lifted her hand to his lips with perfect formality, the kiss landing on her gloved knuckles as cold and ceremonial as a seal pressed to wax. Then he offered his arm and led her down the aisle, through the stunned and whispering throng, into a life she could not begin to imagine. The journey to Cornwall took 2 full days in Nathaniel's well-appointed but austere carriage. They traveled in near silence through changing landscapes, from London's sprawl to gentle countryside to the wild, dramatic terrain of the southwest. When they stopped at posting inns for changes of horses and brief meals, he was unfailingly courteous but distant, maintaining the remote politeness one might extend to an acquaintance, not a wife. It was during the second evening, as they shared a private dining room at an inn near Exeter, that he finally addressed the nature of their arrangement directly. "I must be clear about the terms of our marriage," he said, setting down his wineglass with deliberate care. "Your family's debts have been settled. I have purchased them from the Mortimer Bank and forgiven them entirely. You need have no fear on that account." "You are generous, my lord." "Nathaniel," he interrupted, "we are married. You may dispense with formality in private." "Nathaniel," she amended, the name feeling strange on her tongue. "I must know. Why did you truly intervene? Vengeance against the Mortimers cannot be the whole of it." For the first time since the wedding, something like genuine emotion crossed his face, a tightening around his eyes, a brief press of his lips. "Percival's father, Thaddeus Mortimer, engineered the financial ruin of my father 15 years ago through fraudulent banking practices. My father died of apoplexy brought on by the stress of bankruptcy and public disgrace. I have spent years gathering evidence of the Mortimers' malfeasance. Your public humiliation provided an opportunity to strike at them while simultaneously securing what I require, a wife who will provide an heir to the Ashbourne title." The clinical nature of his explanation chilled her, yet Octavia found herself pressing forward. "That still does not explain why you chose me. There are surely other women." "I saw you standing there," he said quietly, his gaze fixed on some point beyond her shoulder. "I saw the strength in your eyes as you stood there. I saw you refuse to shatter, though you had every reason to do so. He paused, seeming to struggle with the words. "I needed a reminder that such courage still exists in this world, and I required someone who would not expect what I cannot provide." "Cannot provide?" she echoed. "Love," he said bluntly. "Companionship beyond the necessities of producing an heir. My heart died 7 years ago with my wife Anne and my son Thomas. What remains is sufficient for duty, for the management of estates and the continuation of a bloodline, but nothing more. If you can accept such an existence, you will find me a considerate husband in practical matters. If you require affection and warmth, I fear you have made a poor exchange." The words should have devastated her. Instead, Octavia felt a strange sense of relief. At least there would be honesty between them, no false pretenses or disappointed expectations. "I accept those terms," she replied steadily. "I had not expected love from Percival either, merely respect and security. If you can offer those things, I shall not importune you for more." He nodded once, sharply, and they finished their meal in renewed silence. But as they rose to retire to their separate rooms, he surprised her by speaking once more. "There was one other reason," he said, his hand on the doorframe, not looking back at her. "When Mortimer called you peculiar for your interest in science and botany, I thought how Anne would have enjoyed your company. She kept extensive botanical journals. They remain in the conservatory at Ashbourne Manor. You may use them if you wish." Before she could respond, he was gone, leaving her alone with the first indication that beneath his frozen exterior, some small ember of feeling, yet remained. Ashbourne Manor rose from the Cornish cliffs as if carved from the rock itself. All grey stone, narrow windows, and defiant battlements perched on the edge of the world, where land met sea in an eternal battle of rock and wave. As their carriage rattled up the long drive through grounds that showed signs of careful maintenance, but no artistry, Octavia felt her spirits sinking. The interior matched, less a home than a mausoleum where Holland covers draped the furniture and portraits were turned to face the stone. Mrs. Phillips, the housekeeper who had served the Ashbourne family for 3 decades, showed Octavia to her apartments with a mixture of sympathy and wariness, as though uncertain whether this new mistress would survive the gloom that permeated every corridor. "The master keeps himself in the east wing," Mrs. Phillips explained, her keys jangling at her waist as they moved through hallways that echoed with their footsteps. "You'll find him in the library most evenings or walking the cliffs when weather permits. He does not encourage intrusion upon his solitude, my lady. Best to let him come to you." "I understand," Octavia replied, though in truth she understood nothing except that she had entered a place where the living entombed themselves alongside memories of the dead. Her own apartments proved surprisingly comfortable, a bedchamber with views of the sea, a small sitting room with a writing desk, and a dressing room adequate for her modest wardrobe. But comfort could not dispel the essential loneliness of the place. She was 22 years old, newly married, and more isolated than she had ever been in her father's modest household in Hertfordshire. The routine of her new life established itself within days. Breakfast alone in her sitting room. Walks through the grounds, always alone, discovering the bones of what had once been magnificent gardens, now running to wildness. Luncheon in the small dining room, occasionally joined by Nathaniel if he was not occupied with estate business. Afternoons in the library, reading from the extensive collection, carefully avoiding disturbing her husband if he happened to be working at his desk in the corner. Dinner together, always formal, always quiet, the conversation limited to neutral topics. Then separate retirements to separate wings. He came to her bedchamber once each week on Thursday evenings to fulfill what he termed the essential duty of our arrangement. These encounters were performed with a clinical efficiency devoid of affection, a contractual obligation being discharged. He was careful of her comfort, but the act remained a cold transaction. When it was finished, he would dress silently and return to his own chambers, leaving her to lie awake in the darkness and wonder if this was to be the sum total of her marriage. Duty without joy, security without companionship, survival without truly living. But it was during her 3rd week at Ashbourne Manor that Octavia made a discovery that would alter the trajectory of her existence there. Exploring the grounds during a rare morning of sunshine, she ventured beyond the formal gardens into what had once been an extensive kitchen garden, now overgrown with weeds. Beyond this, half hidden by a copse of windswept trees, she found it. A glass conservatory, its panes clouded with years of neglect, its door standing slightly ajar as though inviting her within. The interior took her breath away. Here was a kingdom of abandoned potential, of raised beds filled with soil gone fallow, of workbenches littered with terracotta shards and rusted tools. But most wonderfully, along one entire wall, preserved in glass-fronted cabinets, were books. Dozens of botanical journals filled with pressed specimens, watercolor illustrations of remarkable skill, and careful notations in a feminine hand. Anne Fairfax had been a botanist of serious dedication. Her journals documented years of cultivation and study, from common English wildflowers to exotic specimens acquired through correspondence with collectors across Europe. There were notes on propagation techniques, sketches of root structures, theories about plant hybridization that Octavia found absolutely fascinating. This was no dilettante's hobby, but the work of a genuine scientific mind. Octavia ran her fingers over the leather spines. It was not kinship she felt, but recognition, a validation from a woman she had never met that such interests were valuable and worthwhile. She could work here. She could restore this space, continue this research, create something of worth in the midst of her exile. She spent the entire day in the conservatory, taking inventory of what remained, planning what might be salvaged. When she emerged as the sun was setting over the sea, she was filthy with dust and cobwebs, her dress ruined, her hair falling from its pins, and happier than she had been in months. She did not see Nathaniel watching from his study window, observing her emergence from the abandoned conservatory with an expression that, had she witnessed it, she might have identified as the first stirring of interest beneath his carefully maintained indifference. Over the following weeks, the conservatory became Octavia's refuge and purpose. She cleaned and repaired with her own hands, unwilling to wait for servants to be assigned to the task. She wrote to nurseries in London and Plymouth, ordering seeds and specimens. She studied Anne's journals with the dedication of a scholar, learning techniques and theories, building upon the foundation that had been laid. Nathaniel never commented on her new occupation, though she sometimes felt his presence. A shadow in the doorway of the conservatory, gone before she could turn to acknowledge it. Their evening dinners continued in their usual silence, but occasionally she would catch him watching her with an expression she could not quite decipher. Not disapproval, she thought. Perhaps something closer to curiosity. It was 6 weeks into her residence at Ashbourne Manor when the pattern finally broke. She had been working in the conservatory through the afternoon, losing track of time as she often did when absorbed in her planting and research. When she finally looked up, she realized the light had faded and a storm was blowing in from the sea, the first fat drops of rain already spattering against the glass roof. She hurried back to the house, arriving windblown and laughing at her own dishevelment, only to find Nathaniel standing in the entrance hall as though he had been waiting. "You will catch your death," he said, but there was no heat in the rebuke. "I lost track of time," she admitted, pushing wet hair from her face. "The climbing roses you see, they have begun to bud, and I wanted to ensure they were properly supported before the storm." She stopped, suddenly aware that she was babbling, that he was looking at her with an intensity that made her breath catch. Water dripped from the hem of her dress onto the marble floor. Somewhere in the house, a clock chimed 7. "Come to the library," he said abruptly. "You are soaked through. There is a fire." It was the first time he had directly invited her into his private domain. Octavia followed him through the corridors to the book-lined chamber that served as his sanctuary, accepting the blanket he offered and settling into one of the leather chairs flanking the fireplace while he poured 2 glasses of brandy. "You have been working in Anne's conservatory," he stated, handing her one of the glasses. "I hope that does not distress you," she replied carefully. "I find great solace in the work. Her journals are extraordinary. She had genuine scientific insight." "She would have liked you," Nathaniel said, surprising her. He remained standing, one arm braced against the mantelpiece, staring into the flames. Anne had few peers who understood her passion for botanical study. Most dismissed it as an amusing eccentricity. "You would have been friends, I think." It was the most personal thing he had said to her since their wedding. Octavia felt something shift between them, some slight thawing of the permafrost that had characterized their interactions. "Will you tell me about them?" she asked gently. "About Anne and Thomas, if it does not pain you too greatly." His jaw tightened, and for a moment she thought she had pushed too far. But then he began to speak, his voice low and measured, as though each word required careful extraction from some deep, sealed place. "We married when I was 24, and she was 20. It was arranged by our families, but we found genuine affection for one another. She was clever and kind, with a quick wit that kept me constantly surprised. Thomas was born a year later, a sturdy boy with his mother's laugh. He loved horses and hated Latin lessons, and could never sit still during meals." He paused, taking a long drink of his brandy. The firelight caught the scar on his jaw, made it gleam like silver against his skin. "They took a ship to visit Anne's sister in Ireland. I remained here, managing estate business. The ship foundered in a storm off the Cornish coast. All hands were lost. Their bodies were never recovered. His voice had gone flat, reciting facts rather than reliving emotion. I attended the memorial service. I settled their affairs. Then I locked the doors to their chambers, covered the mirrors, and withdrew from the world. That was 7 years ago. I am sorry, Octavia said quietly. She knew no words could possibly address such loss. Grief is not something one recovers from, Nathaniel replied, still staring into the fire. It is something one learns to carry. Some days the burden is lighter. Other days it threatens to crush entirely. But one continues because there is no alternative. She thought of his intervention at the church, his pragmatic proposal. Is that why you married me? To force yourself to continue? He looked at her then, really looked at her, and she saw in his eyes a complexity of emotion she had not suspected he still possessed. I married you because watching you stand before that altar, humiliated but unbroken, I remembered what it felt like to care about something beyond my own misery. Because your courage reminded me that life continues even when we wish it would not. And because producing an heir provides a purpose when all other purposes have been taken from me. It was honest, brutally so, and somehow that honesty created more intimacy between them than any pretty lie could have managed. They sat in silence for a long while, listening to the storm rage against the windows and the fire crackle in the grate, and Octavia felt that they had perhaps taken the first tentative step toward something that might eventually resemble companionship. After that evening, their relationship began to shift in subtle ways. Nathaniel took to visiting the conservatory in the early mornings, ostensibly to ensure the structure remained sound, but lingering to observe her work. Sometimes he would offer suggestions based on engineering principles he had learned. Better water collection systems, more efficient heating arrangements. His mind, Octavia discovered, was formidable. Self-educated in mathematics and mechanics, he had designed improvements to the railways and mining operations that formed the backbone of his considerable fortune. They began discussing more than just plants and mechanical systems. In the library on rainy evenings, they would debate philosophy and politics, literature and science. Octavia found that Nathaniel possessed a dry wit that emerged only when he felt comfortable, and that beneath his austere exterior lay a man of considerable depth and learning who had simply forgotten how to share those aspects of himself with another person. For his part, Nathaniel seemed to gradually wake from his long sleep of mourning. He had the portrait in the gallery uncovered, the one showing Anne and Thomas, painted when the boy was 3. He opened several of the sealed chambers, allowing Mrs. Phillips to air them and prepare them for eventual use. He even attended services in the village church on Sunday mornings, Octavia at his side, marking his first public appearance in local society in 7 years. The villagers and local gentry did not quite know what to make of the Earl of Ashbourne's resurrection. There were whispers, naturally. The scandalous circumstances of his marriage were known even here, but Octavia found that she cared little for gossip. She had been humiliated before the entire ton. The opinions of Cornish provincials held no terror for her. 3 months into their marriage, on a mild October evening, Nathaniel surprised her by appearing at the conservatory near sunset, carrying a wrapped package. "I have something for you," he said without preamble, extending the parcel. Inside, she found a leather-bound journal, its pages blank and waiting, and a wooden box containing artists' pigments and brushes of exceptional quality. "For documenting your own botanical work," he explained. "Anne's journals end 7 years ago. It seems time for someone to continue the tradition." Octavia felt tears prick at her eyes, the first tears she had shed since leaving London. "This is extraordinarily thoughtful." "You have brought life back to this place," Nathaniel said quietly. "The conservatory blooms. The house no longer feels like a tomb. I thought you deserved tools adequate to your purpose." They stood among the plants as the last light faded from the sky, and Octavia felt something warm and fragile unfurl in her chest. A feeling she dared not name, but recognized nonetheless as the beginning of genuine affection. That night, when Nathaniel came to her chamber, something was different. His touch remained careful, restrained, but there was a tenderness that had not been present in their previous encounters. When he would have risen and left immediately after, as was his custom, Octavia placed a hand on his arm. "Stay," she whispered, "just for a while." He hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with this deviation from their established pattern. But then he settled back against the pillows, and she rested her head on his shoulder, and they lay together in the darkness, listening to the eternal sound of waves against the cliffs. Neither spoke, but the silence between them had transformed from the emptiness of strangers to the quiet communion of two people learning to trust. The fragile peace of their existence was shattered on a cold November morning, when a letter arrived from London bearing the Mortimer family seal. Nathaniel read it at breakfast, his face darkening with each line. When he finished, he set the paper down with such controlled precision that Octavia knew his anger was profound. "What is it?" she asked. "Percival Mortimer has returned from his extended tour of the continent," Nathaniel replied, his voice tight. "He will be attending the Marquis of Thornbury's ball next week. The letter is an invitation, or perhaps a challenge. Thornbury mentions that my return to society would be welcomed and that all of London wishes to see the Earl and Countess of Ashbourne." "We need not go," Octavia said quickly. The thought of facing Percival again, of entering a ballroom filled with those who had witnessed her humiliation, made her stomach twist with anxiety. "On the contrary," Nathaniel said, rising from his chair with sudden decision. "We must go. I have allowed the Mortimers to believe me cowed into rural obscurity. It is time to demonstrate otherwise." She wanted to protest, but the set of his jaw told her his mind was made. So she found herself, a week later, in a London townhouse Nathaniel maintained in Mayfair, preparing for her first social appearance since the catastrophic wedding day. Her gown was new, a creation in deep emerald silk that brought out the amber tones in her eyes. Her maid dressed her hair in the latest fashion, threading it with ribbons. When she examined herself in the mirror, she saw not the humiliated girl of 5 months ago, but the Countess of Ashbourne, wife of one of England's wealthiest and most mysterious peers. Nathaniel waited for her at the foot of the stairs, resplendent in black evening dress that emphasized his dark good looks. When he saw her, something flickered in his eyes. Admiration, she thought, or perhaps appreciation. "You look formidable," he said, offering his arm. "I feel terrified," she admitted. "Good," he replied. "Terror sharpens one's awareness. We go into battle tonight, Octavia. Best to be alert." The Marquis of Thornbury's London residence blazed with light, its ballroom packed with the cream of the ton. Their arrival was announced, and Octavia felt the ripple of reaction move through the crowd. Heads turning, whispers spreading, fans raised to conceal gossiping mouths. For a moment, she wanted to flee. Then she felt Nathaniel's hand cover hers where it rested on his arm, a gesture of solidarity and support. "Courage," he murmured. "You have faced worse." They descended into the ballroom like royalty entering a court of rebels, receiving the greetings of various acquaintances with cool politeness. Some congratulated them on their marriage. Others offered thinly veiled curiosity about the circumstances. Nathaniel deflected all inquiry with practiced ease, his responses courteous but uninformative. It was perhaps inevitable that they would encounter Percival. He stood near the refreshment table surrounded by a small coterie of admirers, looking as handsome and self-satisfied as ever. When he saw them, his expression twisted into something ugly before he schooled his features into a mockery of civility. "Ashbourne," he said with false warmth. "What a surprise to see you in town. And dear Octavia, or should I say, Lady Ashbourne, how unexpected this all turned out." "Lord Mortimer," Nathaniel replied, his voice carrying the temperature of a winter sea. "I trust your continental travels were edifying." "Oh, tremendously," Percival drawled, his eyes moving to Octavia with calculated insult. though I confess I never expected to return and find you married to the peculiar bluestocking I wisely avoided. Tell me, Ashbourne, do you bore easily? Or do you find discussions of Latin plant names stimulating dinner conversation? The comment was designed to wound, to reduce Octavia once again to the object of ridicule. But before she could respond, before the old shame could take root, something remarkable happened. Nathaniel stepped slightly forward, positioning himself between Percival and Octavia with the subtle menace of a wolf defending its mate. When he spoke, his voice remained perfectly modulated, but there was steel beneath the silk. I find my wife's intellect one of her most attractive qualities, Mortimer. A man of limited mental capacity might indeed feel threatened by a woman who can discuss matters beyond fashion and horseflesh. Fortunately, I am not so constrained. The insult landed like a slap. Percival's face flushed, and several members of his coterie tittered behind their fans. But he rallied quickly, his own malice sharpening. "How fortunate for you both," he sneered, "though I suppose when one is desperate enough to steal another man's bride directly from the altar, one cannot be too particular about her oddities." "Steal?" Nathaniel repeated softly, dangerously. An interesting choice of words from a man who publicly humiliated a lady to avoid honoring his family's debts. "Tell me, Mortimer, does the ton know the full extent of your father's banking irregularities? Or shall we discuss how the Mortimer fortune was built on fraudulent lending practices and the systematic ruin of gentlemen unable to repay impossible terms?" The threat was unmistakable. Percival paled, his earlier bravado evaporating. Around them, the nearby conversation had fallen silent, ears straining to catch every word of this increasingly public confrontation. But it was Octavia who delivered the final blow. She stepped forward, drawing herself to her full height, and addressed Percival with a clarity born of 5 months of finding her own strength. "You humiliated me at that altar, my lord, and I shall not pretend otherwise. But you also freed me from a union that would have been built on your contempt and my diminishment. I am grateful to you, Percival. Your cruelty revealed your character before I was permanently bound to it. And in doing so, you led me to a man who values precisely those qualities you found so objectionable. So yes, I am peculiar. I am intellectual. I am passionate about matters you consider unfeminine. And I am proud of those things, as I could never have been as your wife." The silence that followed her speech seemed to stretch endlessly. Then, from somewhere in the crowd, someone began to applaud, slowly at first, then joined by others. Lady Thornbury herself, the formidable marchioness who ruled London society with an iron fan, smiled approvingly. Percival, outmaneuvered and publicly chastised, could do nothing but retreat, his face mottled with fury and humiliation. As he stalked away, Nathaniel turned to Octavia, and she saw in his eyes something that took her breath away. Pride, yes, but also something warmer, something that spoke of genuine admiration, and perhaps the first stirrings of an emotion neither of them had expected to feel. "That was extraordinary," he said quietly. "That was necessary," she replied, her heart still racing from the confrontation. "I could not allow him to define me any longer." "You have never been what he claimed," Nathaniel said, and there was a weight to his words that suggested he spoke of more than just the immediate exchange. "From the first moment I saw you, I recognized your strength. I simply did not expect you to so thoroughly validate my assessment." They danced together for the first time that night, a waltz that felt like a celebration of their unexpected partnership. And though Octavia knew their relationship remained complicated, built as it was on pragmatism rather than romance, she felt the foundations shifting beneath her feet, transforming into something neither of them had planned, but both might learn to cherish. The weeks following the Thornbury ball brought a measure of peace. They returned to Cornwall, to Ashbourne Manor and the conservatory, to their evening conversations in the library. But the nature of their interactions had changed. Nathaniel sought her company more frequently, appearing at odd hours to consult her opinion on estate matters, or simply to share some amusing passage from a book. Their Thursday encounters in her bedchamber had transformed. The clinical efficiency was gone, replaced by lingering touches and quiet conversation, an intimacy of words as well as bodies. Octavia found herself increasingly aware of him. The way his rare smiles transformed his severe features, the careful attention he paid to her comfort and happiness, the intelligence that sparked behind his dark green eyes. What had begun as a marriage of convenience was becoming something far more complicated. It was in late December, as winter settled over the Cornish coast with storms that battered the cliffs and sent spray high against the conservatory windows, that disaster struck. Octavia woke to the smell of smoke. She ran to her window to see flames engulfing the conservatory, bright against the pre-dawn darkness. She threw a wrapper over her nightdress and raced through the corridors, screaming for help. But by the time servants mobilized and Nathaniel emerged from his chambers, it was too late. They could only stand in the cold rain and watch as 5 months of work, as Anne's journals and decades of botanical research, as every growing thing Octavia had nurtured, was consumed by merciless fire. When the flames were finally extinguished, leaving only a skeleton of twisted metal and shattered glass, Octavia walked through the ruins like a woman in a trance. The journals were ash. The specimens were destroyed. Everything she had built, everything she had used to create purpose in her exile, was gone. She found in the charred remains of the workbench something half buried in mud and ash, a silver cigar case, expensive and distinctive, engraved with ornate scrollwork she did not recognize. It gleamed incongruously among the blackened debris. Nathaniel found her there, kneeling in the ruin, the case clutched in her hand. When he saw what she held, his face transformed into something terrible. He took it from her trembling fingers, turned it over, and his jaw set with a fury that was all the more frightening for how carefully he controlled it. "This belongs to Percival Mortimer," he said, his voice deadly quiet. "I have seen him use it. He must have given this to the agent he hired. The fool dropped it in his haste. This proves Percival's hand in it." "He hired someone?" she whispered. "To come all this way? To burn?" "He has gone too far," Nathaniel said. "This time, he will answer for it." Over the next weeks, Nathaniel waged a campaign of systematic destruction against the Mortimer family. Using evidence he had compiled over years, he exposed Thaddeus Mortimer's fraudulent banking practices to the authorities and to every influential family who held accounts with the Mortimer Bank. The result was catastrophic. A run on the bank, investigations by regulators, the calling in of loans, and the collapse of credit. Within a month, the Mortimer banking empire lay in ruins. Percival himself, facing potential criminal charges for arson, fled to France. Nathaniel ensured that warrants would be waiting should he ever attempt to return to England, effectively exiling him permanently. It was vengeance, pure and complete, and Octavia should have felt satisfaction. Instead, she felt only emptiness. The conservatory remained a skeleton. The journals were still ash. Percival's punishment did not restore what had been taken. She spent her days walking the cliffs, unable to find purpose or direction. Nathaniel tried to reach her, but she felt wrapped in layers of grief too thick to penetrate. She had lost her father's regard, her reputation, and now her sanctuary. What remained? It was Nathaniel who finally broke through. He found her one gray afternoon in the ruins of the conservatory, standing amid the wreckage with her arms wrapped around herself against the cold. He did not speak, simply stood beside her, solid and patient as the granite cliffs themselves. "I brought you into my broken life," he said at last. "I thought I could offer you security without cost, but I was wrong. My darkness has touched you, damaged you. The conservatory was your light in this place of shadows, and because of my enemy, it is destroyed." "It was not your fault," Octavia replied, though her voice held little conviction. "I lied to you," Nathaniel continued, and now he turned to face her, and she saw something raw and vulnerable in his expression. "At the church, I told you I needed a countess, a woman to provide an heir. I told you it was a business arrangement, but that was not the entire truth." "What do you mean?" I saw you standing there, humiliated and abandoned, and I saw your strength. And for the first time since Anne and Thomas died, I felt something other than numbness. Not merely sympathy, but recognition, kinship, hope that perhaps life might hold meaning beyond mere survival. He reached up, fingers trembling slightly, and touched her face with a gentleness that made her eyes burn with tears. I did not marry you for revenge or heirs. I married you because you reminded me what it felt like to be alive. And now I have allowed my past to destroy the one thing that brought you happiness. Nathaniel, I love you, Octavia, he said, the words emerging with the force of a confession too long suppressed. I have loved you since that first evening in the library when you spoke of Anne with such kindness, since you restored the conservatory and brought color back to these gray walls, since you stood before Percival Mortimer and refused to let him diminish you. I love your mind, your courage, your passionate curiosity about the world. You saved me from a half-life of mourning. You returned my soul to me, and I have repaid you by bringing destruction to your door. Octavia stared at him, stunned into silence. Love. He loved her. This man who had claimed his heart was dead, who had offered her a marriage devoid of affection, who had held himself apart even as they grew closer. He loved her. Then rebuild it, she heard herself say. What? Rebuild the conservatory, she repeated, her voice growing stronger. Make it larger. Make it better. Fill it with specimens from across the world. Hire botanists to assist in the research. Create something that honors Anne's memory and continues her work, but looks to the future rather than the past. Understanding dawned in his eyes. You would want that? After everything? I would want that, she confirmed, taking his face between her hands, with you beside me. Not as a duty or obligation, but as a true partner. Because, Nathaniel, I love you too. I think I have loved you since you defended me at the Thornbury Ball, perhaps even before that. I love your brilliant mind and your dry humor and the way you see me truly, not as I am expected to be, but as I am. You did not save me at that altar. We saved each other. He kissed her then, there in the ruins of what had been destroyed, and it was nothing like their previous, careful intimacies. It was desperate and honest, a claiming and a surrender, the first true expression of the feeling that had grown between them through months of quiet companionship and hard-won trust. When they finally drew apart, both breathless, Nathaniel rested his forehead against hers. A new conservatory, he said, with the finest glass and the most advanced heating systems, a proper research library, everything you need to document and study and create. Will that suffice? It will more than suffice, Octavia replied, smiling through tears. But Nathaniel, there is something else you should know. He pulled back slightly, concerned. What is it? I am with child, she said softly. I have suspected for several weeks, but was uncertain. Now I am sure. His expression cycled through shock, disbelief, and finally joy. Pure, unguarded joy, such as she had never seen on his face before. He swept her into his arms, spinning her once before setting her carefully down, as though she had suddenly become impossibly fragile. A child, he breathed. Octavia, are you certain? As certain as one can be at this stage, she confirmed. In the autumn, if all goes well. Then I must rebuild the conservatory immediately, he declared with sudden urgency. Our child must have beauty and growing things, not ruins and ash, and you must have every comfort, every care. I must have you, she interrupted, laughing at his sudden panic. The rest will follow. They returned to the house hand in hand, already making plans. That night, for the first time, Nathaniel remained in her chambers until dawn, holding her close as they spoke of the future they would build together. A future neither had expected, but both now embraced with all the fierce hope of second chances claimed from the jaws of despair. The new conservatory rose from the ashes of the old over the winter months, constructed with such speed and quality that it drew the admiration of engineers and natural philosophers throughout England. Twice the size of its predecessor, built with revolutionary engineering that Nathaniel had designed himself, it featured separate zones for different climates, an extensive library for research, and state-of-the-art systems for temperature and humidity control. Nathaniel hired 3 trained botanists to assist Octavia's work and established correspondence with botanical societies across Europe and beyond. Specimens began arriving, seeds from the Americas, cuttings from India, preserved samples from Africa. The conservatory became not merely a hobby, but a legitimate center of botanical research, with Octavia at its heart. But more miraculous than any glass palace was the transformation of Ashbourne Manor itself. The house that had been a mausoleum became a home. The shuttered chambers were opened and aired and filled with light. Nathaniel had the portrait of Anne and Thomas hung in the main hall where it could be properly seen and honored, no longer hidden away as though love was something to be feared. In February, he took Octavia to the sealed chamber that had been Thomas's nursery. Together, they opened the door and looked upon the toys and small furniture that had been preserved exactly as they were 7 years earlier. "Our child will use these," Nathaniel said quietly. "If it is a boy, we could call him Thomas if you are willing, not to replace what was lost, but to honor it." "I would like that very much," Octavia replied, threading her fingers through his. "And if it is a girl? Then we shall name her something strong and beautiful," he said, turning to her with a smile that had become increasingly common on his once severe face. "Something that speaks of new beginnings. Perhaps Anne Octavia?" "Perfect," she agreed. In September, as autumn painted Cornwall in shades of amber and gold, Octavia gave birth to a healthy son. They named him Thomas Nathaniel Fairfax, and when Nathaniel held him for the first time, tears streamed openly down his face, tears of grief for what had been lost, and tears of joy for what had been found. The baby had Octavia's amber eyes and a crown of dark hair that suggested he would favor his father's coloring. He was sturdy and loud, and absolutely perfect, and watching Nathaniel with their son, Octavia felt her heart might burst with the unexpected abundance of her happiness. "I thought I was done with living," Nathaniel confessed one night as they sat together in the nursery, watching Thomas sleep. "I thought I would simply exist until death claimed me. But you changed everything. You brought me back to life." "We brought each other back," Octavia corrected gently. "I was as lost as you, in my own way. Both of us broken by public humiliation and private grief. But somehow we found each other in the ruins and built something new." "Something better," Nathaniel agreed, drawing her close. "I loved Anne, and I will always carry that love. But what we have found together is different, forged in survival and strengthened by choice. I love you, Octavia Fairfax, with everything I am and everything I have yet to become. And I love you," she replied, resting her head against his shoulder. "My unexpected husband, my partner in all things, my heart." They sat together in the quiet nursery, listening to their son's soft breathing and the eternal sound of the sea beyond the windows, 2 people who had been given up for lost but had somehow found their way to the shore. One evening, as they walked together through the conservatory, now in its 10th year, Nathaniel stopped before a climbing rose bred to withstand coastal winds while producing blooms of exceptional beauty. "This rose is your design, is it not?" he said, examining the delicate petals. "It is as resilient as its breeder." Octavia smiled, touching one perfect bloom. "We are all more resilient than we imagine, I think. Until circumstance demands, we prove it." "You certainly proved it," he said, turning to face her, his green eyes warm in the fading light. "From the moment you stood before that altar, refusing to surrender your dignity even as the world collapsed around you. You were magnificent then. You are magnificent still. And you are mine, Octavia said simply. My unexpected salvation, my truest partner, the man who saw me at my lowest moment and offered me not just rescue, but recognition. I would not change a single moment of our story, not even the painful beginning, because it led me here. To you. To us. They stood together among the plants and flowers, surrounded by growing things and the evidence of their shared passions, and knew themselves blessed beyond measure. Love had found them not despite their brokenness, but through it, and had made them both more whole than they had ever been alone. Dear listener, perhaps you too have stood at your own altar of humiliation, facing rejection that seemed to destroy everything. Remember, what feels like an ending is often the clearing away of what was never meant to be. Your darkest moments do not define you. Your resilience does. And like Octavia and Nathaniel, you may discover that your greatest happiness emerges not from the plans you made, but from the unexpected grace that rises from the ruins. Thank you for staying with us through this entire journey. If Octavia and Nathaniel's story touched your heart, please like, subscribe, and share with someone who needs to hear it. Your support helps us continue creating stories of resilience, hope, and unexpected love.